Hello, everyone. My name is Malcolm Gladwell. I am here at the behest of the Writers Guild Foundation to do a conversation with two of the most extraordinary storytellers in Hollywood, Brit Marling and Zal Batmanglij. And we're going to talk principally about their most recent collaboration, Murder at the End of the World, but we will also inevitably digress. In fact, if I had to predict, there's going to be more digression than there is a conversation on the subject matter at hand. But anyway, Zal, Brit, hello.
Oh, Malcolm, hi. It's fun to digress and not digress with you. Wherever you take us, we're
Wherever.
going.
Yes. Zal, hello, hello.
Hi.
Um, so I thought we would start as a kind of, before we get into murder, we could call it murder, can we? You can shorten it to murder. Um, I want to talk, I want viewers, listeners to understand a little bit about your collaboration. And I want to talk about collaboration, what that means to you. Um, you guys have known each other forever. How long?
Oh my gosh. I think are we getting to be like 18, 19 years or something?
Oh no, it's 20 years since we moved to LA.
Oh my
Exactly.
God. Okay, so don't even tell me that.
So it's like 22 years, I think.
A
Yeah.
long time. We met in college. I was a freshman and we were both at Georgetown, which is not a school that you necessarily go to thinking of the arts. Um, but we were all interested in the arts, though I was studying economics. And Georgetown had its first ever film festival while I was there. And I went to see a film that was playing. And it won the festival. Hey, it easily won the festival. And two people got up, on stage to accept the award, and it was Zal and his friend Mike Cahill. And they were like cool upperclassmen who had just won the festival with this film. And I was like, okay, I got to get to know those two. So I spent my sophomore year following them around on campus, trying to figure out how to get an introduction. And I saw Zal in the campus supermarket, which was called Vital Vittles. And I like worked up the nerve to tap him on the shoulder. And I was like, hey, I study economics, but I study photography as well. And I have access to all these lights and lighting equipment. Like maybe I could come light one of your films for you. And Zal took a look at me and was like, you could come light one of the films. You could also maybe be in one of the films. And
Oh,
then we were kind of off to the races after that. And that was over 20 years ago.
Well, I didn't under Brit had it was my first, I think, real experience with star power. She had this thing. At first, you thought it was the looks, but then it was like something from inside. I mean, I didn't know, I didn't know Brit. I would come to find out that she would spend all her time at the lowest level of the library. The library had these subterranean floors in which people, very pale people who never saw the sun worked. And Brit was often there. She was actually uh, uh book smart, like a nerd. Like I didn't know that. I was so taken by her.
by the so what was it's very meet cute, is what you're saying.
It was
That
very cute.
What was your first creative collaboration? By creative, I don't mean the first thing you wrote together, not the first thing you may have had other forms. What was the first thing you wrote or conceived together?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So I went to the AFI, American Film Institute, and studied directing. And I graduated with, a master's in directing, but no one will give you a directing job. And Brit was auditioning to act. And so I was like, well, how are we going to break into this? I mean, we didn't know anybody. We didn't have any connections. Our parents had no friends. Like we lived in a guest house on the top of Laurel Canyon. So we were very sort of cut off. And Brit said, well, we'll just teach ourselves how to write. I said, what? She said, we'll just teach ourselves how to write. And Brit sort of devised the curriculum. We would go to public libraries in LA and she would check out, like books on writing, and we would read them and then start write. I mean, I didn't know that you could teach yourself things. I didn't grow up with that sort of mindset. Brit felt like she could do anything. And that has been the biggest gift in my life. It's just the feeling that like things you don't know you can learn. I mean, it sounds stupid, but I really didn't know that at 24 or at 25 or whatever.
What I'm interested in is whether collaboration in your early days meant something differently than collaboration does today, right? So if you compare the way you worked together on Murder with the way you would have worked together in the beginning.
Well, Brit, I want you to tell the story, but can I just say that Brit and I right now, Malcolm, right now, are working on that first thing that we wrote. We are going to take it out and try to sell it as a show.
Wait, the first thing you wrote 20 years ago?
Yes.
That we never made because it was too dazzling a story. It was like too sprawling and this big world, all these characters. There was no way that two people who had never made anything before were going to get the backing to make something like that. So maybe now we could finally do it. But the question that you're asking is a really interesting one, Malcolm, because I think what happens if you start collaborating very young is that your sense of how to do something is bound up with each other. It's like, even if Zal and I never spoke again, anything I would write going forward would have Zal in it because we, at this point, have so much mind share together. Like, I didn't even know about making movies until we started making them with each other. So all my ideas, not only for how you make them, but why you make them and why storytelling is important or why it matters, it's all been sort of bound up with each other in a really beautiful way. So I'm not sure, you know, if Zal and I decided one day to stop working together, I'm not sure I would still be a filmmaker. I might go tell stories in some other way, but very much the apparatus of how we do it is how we taught it to each other, if that makes sense. So it's like baked in with the fundamentals. I've collaborated with other people on things, you know, in different ways, different capacities since then. And it can be beautiful and rewarding and there's a lovely energy about it. But I think between us, there's a depth and a resonance about it and an incredible shorthand. You know, we can be in a meeting on a murder, for instance, where there's like, you know, 20 people in a room with department heads and we're all trying to figure out how to solve something. And Zal and I can just look at each other from across the room and know whether we think an idea someone has presented is going to fly or not going to fly. And we just have to raise an eyebrow at each other. There's this sort of, I don't know, maybe like a twinship or something. You develop this ability to communicate in a kind of secret language in a way. I don't know if it's hard to articulate.
Well, actually, I learned about what you're talking about from Malcolm. Malcolm, is it season 3 or 2, The Shared Mind, the Churchill one? What?
Oh, yeah, vaguely. Yes.
There was a podcast. I remember being in the desert and going out to dinner with a friend, and we were listening to the podcast, and it was so powerful, this idea of deep friendships having shared minds, so that like when the person dies, you carry it's like a part of you has died. And we got back to the apartment or whatever, and the podcast was so powerful, Malcolm, that we just stayed in the parking lot under all the stars in the desert, just listening to it till the end. And I didn't understand that stuff about shared minds and how when you're young, I think the same thing is true probably if you get married young too. You know, there are real benefits to sort of fusing when you're wet clay.
Is it separable? If you go back now and watch an episode of Murder, for example, can you say, oh, that's Brit, that's me, that's Brit, that's me, or is it all blurred at this point?
I think specifically this time we tried to separate it more because, you know, with there's chapter 5 in A Murder at the End of the World, and Brit wrote that kind of on her own. She went into one of her subterranean basement rooms and just wrote it. And I remember reading pages of it in one of the rooms here, and it was just this scene with Bill and Darby on a log, and Bill wants to throw his phone out into the desert, and then Darby, the scene ends with Darby saying, "Well, I fell in love with you," on this phone. So there was this turning, you know, this not easy relationship with technology. And I remember closing those pages or putting those pages down and looking up at Brit and just being like, this scene is so moving. I hope we don't lose any of it in the shooting of it. And then Brit directed her work for the first time in Murder on her own. And, you know, they went out into the desert and shot this scene. And I remember watching the first cut, and it was just as good, if not better, than the pages. And a lot of times Brit had written in OA like amazing scenes like the octopus scene, but I think I fucked it up. You know, I didn't fuck it up, but there is a line Brit can thread. It's almost like an anime line. And I'm so excited about this next phase in our collaboration because she's directing the things she's writing. And so there's even a clearer bell happening. So I'm excited about being able to differentiate it more. I don't know what you would say, Brit.
I would say that maybe in the beginning it was easier to parse out. And like I can remember certain moments where, for instance, when we were making the OA together, I remember the day in the writer's room, you know, the OA had a very small writer's room. It was 5 of us, and 2 people had never written for the screen before, and we had never made television. And then there was like 1 seasoned TV writer, and we really had no business making a TV show. But Zal and I had this idea that we were going to make something that felt like a novel. And I remember we were working on the ending chapters, and Zal came in one day and acted out, really. This is one of the secret sauces of our collaboration, is that Zal's a better actor than I am. He acted out, performed in the writer's room, the scene where the sheriff's wife is lying in bed and has ALS and can't move, and OA and Homer do the movements above her, and she starts to regain, you know, consciousness and movement. And then she does the 5th movement for them. She gives them that movement. And when Zal acted out that scene, like the others of us in the room, we just watched it. It was like watching a one-man show of it. It was so beautiful. And then we tried to do our best writing it, tried to do our best casting that woman, getting exactly the right woman who could pull that performance off, make it feel real, finding the right score to put underneath it with Danny and Sandra, like all of it. And I think we did pull it off. And I can trace that feeling that I get when I watch that scene in the show back to the feeling Zal gave me in the writer's room when he told me that. Like now, as we go further along, it's much harder for me to parse it out, you know, like the octopus thing, you know, Zal brought up the octopus thing. It's like, I remember pitching that out, but I also remember we'd read a book first about octopus, you know, consciousness. And we'd been talking about that even like 2 years prior. And then we'd had different conversations about how aquatic life might play in a story for another story we were working on. And then somehow the idea just like found its way into the OA organically. And that the further we go on, the harder it is to trace it back to a single person. I think it's kind of an interesting thing about ego, actually. I think some of the really good stories are not authored in the way we think of them in terms of fiction. I think they're almost more received. And any person or group of people who are an open satellite dish and clean themselves, you know, keep the dish clean as they can, is able to sort of receive it. I think that's why you sometimes see narratives come in at the same time. You know, the Duffer Brothers are good friends of ours. They made Stranger Things. It was uncanny. We were making OA as they were making Stranger Things. These 2 things came out. We never talked to each other about each other's ideas, but both of them had, you know, strange girls in them who had nosebleeds and like psychic, you know, abilities. And then this like group of teenage boys that for some reason needed that encounter. You know, theirs was more squarely situated in the young adult sort of space, and ours was about a group of people who were a little older. But the fact that those sort of stories were feeling the same thing at the same time, which is like a kind of crisis of how do young boys become men dealing with toxic masculinity in America, like those threads were out there for any storyteller to receive. And so in some ways, I guess between Zal and I, we just start dissolving the ego part a little earlier than maybe a single author would. We already sort of feel between us like, who knows where these things come from? They kind of just come in. Does that make sense? Is that?
What does disagreement look like?
I'm trying to think of the last genuine, real disagreement.
I mean, I think we have disagreements in life, but I don't know about work disagreements. Have we had like a big work disagreement? I mean, Brit's usually right.
I think it's actually that usually the best thing for the story is quite obvious. It's sort of like the story is a queen and we're all her, servants. And we propose different things. And, when it's right for the queen, it's right for the queen, and she will tell you, and that isn't either one of us as authors or filmmakers or thinkers or whatever. It's this third space. And in the third space, the story is the boss. And so it kind of makes it hard to have disagreements because the story will tell you kind of what it wants. I mean, I think we think a lot later after we've made something about how we would make it better. We do that all the time. We go back to the East, and literally 10 years after we made the East, I remember driving down Sunset Boulevard, like on my way to like get a cup of coffee, and Zal called me and he's like, I know how we should have done the East. Like, we didn't do the right setup for Sarah Moss. This is what we should have done. And he pitched it out to me, and then I started riffing on that, and then he riffed on that, and then we like recreated the story, and we were like, oh, that's the story as it should have been. We were just too young as storytellers to fully articulate what we were feeling at the time. So there's a lot of that, but not so much disagreement with each other.
Are you sure? It's funny. I just recently I rarely do collaborations. I'm just finishing a project, which is my first real collaboration in a very long time. And it's worked very well. But my conclusion is about why there's no disagreement and I'm curious for you to react to this. It's that I've realized over the years that it's not that there's one logical way for a story to go and that becomes obvious. It's the opposite. It's like there's 10 ways to resolve it. And you can be attached to number 2 and someone else can be attached to number 6. And then you can both decide, oh, actually, let's do 7. And it's fine. You could have done 8 or 9 or 1. And like what you realize is
it doesn't matter.
We're still going to get there. When I was interviewing Paul Simon, he told me this hilarious story about trying to find some legendary R&B studio somewhere in the South. And they stop and this old man gives them directions and they go on for 10 minutes. And finally the old man says, and then you drive past the golf course and then you take a U-turn and then you turn right. And then Paul said, well, could we just turn left before we go past? And the guy said, you can do that too. Which I always think about that now because I was like, you could do that too. Like,
yeah.
Wait, so which is it? Is it there's 10 solutions or one obvious one?
Well, I don't know. When you say that, I know what you mean by that. I do know what you mean by that. It's like you're saying, and I think it's true, that the thing of value is the collaboration in and of itself. So that is the play, the revelry. It could be solution 2, it could be 6 or 7. The point is we're enjoying each other's minds and we're having fun together and we're spitting this thing out and we make something and it hits the world. And, I get what you mean by that. And I feel that between Zal and I often, but maybe because we've been trying to tell things since we were like 18 together, there's this feeling of being after something quite specific, and you're trying to get your skill set good enough to articulate it. And it feels like a lot of our 20s and 30s has been about trying to acquire these skills, like not just trying to get good enough at turning a scene or turning an act, but also like getting good enough at like how to manage a budget and how to make these things, that have big ideas, but make them for a price, and how to find the right department heads to pull some of these different things off. And it's sort of like you're trying to get better every time you do it at all those different sieves, I guess, that the story has to go through. But it does sometimes feel like the juice concentrate that we're after at the end. It's like sometimes we'll get a thing where we'll be like, well, it could be option 2 or option 8, but option 5 is the option that will give you that feeling of that particular juice, like I'm thinking about Scott Brown's Resurrection in the OA, it's such a specific feeling you're after. And there are a lot of different ways to solve for it, but there's only a couple that will give you that particular feeling of making the audience surrender disbelief and like buy this wild idea that these like two people doing movements across from each other create some sort of, you know, angelic technology or this like this magical effect of you know, bringing this person back from the other side, you know. So I don't know, Z, I'd be curious what you would say about it. I don't know if that's
I guess I think something you said, I think Malcolm, maybe in the future making filmed storytelling will be easier. So this will be, you know, not as such an issue, but I feel like the time when you're actually storytelling or collaborating on the story is such precious time that you're kind of just having a good time and doing that old improv, yes, and then shaping it and having fun with it. And it's the harder part, and the part where we could have disagreements or where there can be sort of grit, is just trying to get these things made. How do you pitch them? How do you then, once they've been greenlit, how do you get them off the ground? How do you then market them? There's just so much that goes into getting these things made. That's the really hard, I find that's the really hard part.
Mm-hmm.
Does this make you want
I
to
wonder.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, does this make you want to do more collaborations, this experience that you had? Or are you like, no, there's something essential about when I'm alone in a room by myself, articulating something that I can feel and like getting it on the page?
Well, which actually leads me to my next question. Collaborations, when they work, are more fun. And what I realized in doing mine, and I'd be curious to have you guys think about it, is that there were moments when I was privileging the collaboration over the work, in a way that actually I think is really productive. In other words, I would agree to something because I thought that it would, if I said yes, or I think that the reverse would be true of the guy I was collaborating, Ben. Ben would say yes to things because he knew that if he said yes or I said that it would make the next stage, next unknown stage in our collaboration work better.
Mm.
So there's an element of faith. Like in the story we were telling, there was a point where I said to Ben, we have to go to Alabama, to this little town in northwestern Alabama. And he's like, why? And I gave him an answer which I think he felt was completely unconvincing. But he then just came and it was great. And then he told me something about he wanted to do about Jesse Owens. And it sounded so twee and precious. I would never have done it. And I was like, whatever. Yeah, you know, go ahead, go and do it. And I was being a little bit condescending. It's the best thing in the whole series. So like, in both cases, each of us conceded to the other slightly against our better judgment, and it worked out. And so we didn't put the story first. We put the collaboration first, and the story
each other first.
Yeah. And the story ended up being way better as a result.
That's so interesting. Basically, you went out on a limb for each other, and you did the yes and of improv. You said yes to something that you didn't actually think was going to work, and in so doing, you opened yourself up to a space of new risk that ended up reaping great reward. That makes sense to me.
The Ben one is actually more spectacular than mine. In Ben's case, he said, I want to do an episode about this story that Jesse Owens once told. And I think there's something wrong with it. Like that. It's like, Jesus, come on now. We're trying to tell this big, huge, you know, blah, blah, and you're like obsessing about some guy. This guy's not even central to our narrative, blah, blah, blah. I was 100% wrong. But if I didn't, but I'm reminded of this, like what you guys have it strikes me as a highly evolved version of this. You are so committed to each other. This is natural. It's just like it's how you guys do business.
But also it's true. Oh, what were you going to say, Brit?
I was going to say, I think that's true. I think we don't even mark that moment you're talking about where you're like, this guy's off his rocker, but okay, for the sake of the friendship that's developing here, I'm going to let him have this one. I think we've been doing that for so long. We don't even know when we're doing that anymore, or if we are. Yeah.
But I think it's about the inverse too. It's about when it doesn't work. And when your partners led you down the path. I have definitely led Brit down I mean, you guys both remember the NFTs that I was obsessed with. You know, I thought we could do OA NFTs, you know, like, but I was wrong, and Brit didn't, she didn't punish me for that. Leaving the room to sort of take risks, follow wild ideas, I think is also really important. You know.
Well, because isn't that where the real marrow is of a life well lived in an interesting relationship, is actually when it doesn't, the times where you follow someone and it doesn't necessarily go the direction you had both hoped, but that's where the depth of the relationship comes from those things. And those have gone back and forth between us for years. You know, like I remember, you know, there were some casting things and things that we've made where I've been like, oh, it should be this person, you know, and then we both look at the project and we're like, okay, well, maybe that wasn't exactly the right choice, but you stop keeping score at some point. And I think that's when the relationship gets really interesting, is when you're no longer, you're not like, you would never hold those things against each other. You're just like, well, there was a fork in the road and we chose a slightly bumpier path, but wasn't it interesting? The friction, the things we saw, the people we encountered, like, this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Malcolm, is it's all kind of the journey anyway. I mean, where are any of us even trying to go or get or do? It's kind of just who's in the car with you on the ride.
Well, I read this thing. We're almost done talking about collaborations, although I do love talking about collaborations. I read this thing yesterday by Matt Iglesias about talking about, you know, the problem of college presidents. Nobody wants to be a college president anymore. Job's too hard. And he says, well, it's actually, the job's too hard because one person can't do it anymore. It's too many different things. And so you need to have two presidents. You got to divide it up in some way. And it made me think, is the kind of storytelling you guys want to do, like in Murder, can you not do it with one person? Like when I watch Murder, because I know you guys, when I watch Murder because I know you, I thought, oh, you had to have both of them. By themselves, they couldn't have. There's too much. There's this love story going on here. There's this really interesting, very engaged political thing going on here. There's a kind of riff on ensemble murder mysteries going on here. There's Iceland. There's, you know, there's just so much. And I figure, I don't think if it was just one of you, I feel like, or one of, it's a much simpler or diminished story. Do you think that's true?
I think I would again go to, I'm less focused on the story. This is kind of an interesting thing. We need to unpack this later, Britt, and more on the making of it. You know, recently Britt brought up the Duffer Brothers. The four of us had dinner and we were just dying of laughter. I mean, we were just falling. I mean, we hadn't drank anything. All of us were like falling out of our chairs because we could tell story. We were like, how does anyone do this on their own? And I don't think we were thinking about the storytelling part because that's just so much fun. You could do it on your own, I guess. But just the navigating the personalities, the studios, these giant companies, you know, the very interesting people who run them. If you had to navigate all that by yourself or with your agent, it would be so lonely and isolating. There's something so delicious about having a partner in crime going through all that.
I mean, just, I guess also too, it's like the just sheer number of crises. Like it's, you know, we had chartered a plane. We were shooting in Iceland because this was during COVID times. And we thought, well, Iceland has the, you know, lowest number of COVID cases. We're going to go there, be very safe. We charter a plane. We put the cast and crew all on this plane in New York. And then we fly, you know, to Iceland. It's all going to be great. We're bubbled together. While the plane is in midair, Iceland reverses its COVID policy and decides to go for herd immunity. So by the time we land, it's just like going across all of Iceland. So everybody gets it on the crew and waves, you know, and we're in a remote part of Northern Iceland. It's like not easy to get any groceries, medical help, anything. And at the same time, we're being battered by these storms from the climate crisis that are coming from directions they've never come from before, and like staying for durations and dropping an amount of snow that's unprecedented even for Iceland. And so it's insane. I mean, sometimes making these things, it's like an extreme sport. And I don't know how people who do it on their own get through. I think certainly there is something to what you're saying about just the sheer level of ambition of these stories. I think we put so much into them. I'm not sure a single showrunner, director could, I think it would be nearly impossible to pull them off at the budgets we've pulled them off at. I think it comes from the fact that you're actually getting a lot of, I don't know if I should say this, but you're getting a lot of free labor basically out of the two of us, because we're doing it from a place of love. Like, we love each other and we love the story. So we work so intensely, wearing so many different hats, and you're getting kind of that free labor. I mean, I don't think you could, if you really divided it up properly into all the proper roles, it would be too much. Like, the ambitious nature of the shows would be hard to afford, I think, but maybe that's me talking out of school.
But you know, Britt, as you're bringing up the crisis in Iceland, it really underlines this, because what happened when Britt's saying all that is that in the middle of all this, Britt gets hypothermia, Malcolm, and they rush her to the hospital. She's having all these complications to hypothermia. So I all of a sudden become a solo person trying to navigate these crises and keep the project upright, you know, the ship from tilting. And I felt as if my superpowers were taken away from me. I don't know if it was because I was so worried about Brit, I couldn't focus, and like I just didn't care about the show, and I just cared about Brit, and I wanted her to be healthy. I don't know if it's that the support of each other allows us to navigate the world with a kind of strength. It's that shared brain thing. But literally, the ship during that week that Brit was out in Iceland, so the ship really went off course, and it wasn't just that we had lost Brit's acumen, but it was also that I was not able without Brit to sort of be present, not fully present.
But you know, this gets even more complicated than this, because if we're being really honest, a huge part of it is also that we're telling stories that are really ambitious. They're not really like things you've seen before. They're usually starring women. They have a queer point of view on the world. Like, we are not the straight white male showrunner and director that is very able to move the levers and apparatuses of the town to get it to function. You know, like, we're coming from so far outside that in some ways, to even just give ourselves permission to write these stories that are so far out of the box, I think if we didn't have each other and reinforce each other's point of view and be like, yeah, keep going. Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, that's never been done before. Yeah, that's a perspective we haven't seen, but like, I can feel what you're after. Like, let's keep going there. And so I think because we're able to do that in the script phase, like sort of buffer each other, where if it had to meet the world too soon, it would just get attacked and pulled apart for being different, for basically not being the history of storytelling that we've seen up to date largely. So I think we create that incubation phase with each other, and then we're able to face, able to put on the armor and like do all the things you got to do to like get the football or the baby, across the finish line. Anyway, all that to say that I think a huge part of this is also just about identity and like and perspective, and trying to like fight to have new perspectives enter the world, and at a scale and at a budget that you just don't traditionally see, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense, because that's Barbenheimer at a nutshell. When you keep it the same voice, someone can take a book written by a dude and then adapt it for the screen and then direct it, and it's beautiful, nice through line. But Greta and Noah had to sort of fuse together, buffer together to have the audacity to write Barbie. I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah. How do you shift gears a little bit? I'm curious about, I want to talk about what it means to reflect on the work that you've done. Starting with murder, but go back to some other stuff if you like. When you look back on work once it's completed, with the benefit of a at least some time in the middle? What do you see that you didn't see when you were making it?
Yesterday I called Brit, I think, and I was just reflecting on OA because there's enough time to start reflecting on OA. And I was thinking, oh, I wish I'd felt more confident about the bold swings we took. You know, we took some really bold swings, and we don't really work in a business that really rewards that. It's a very conservative, the movie business is incredibly conservative, as opposed to, let's say, the fashion business or, you know, Silicon Valley or something like that. Like, the movie business is really, really like bro-y. And I wish that I hadn't been so affected by people being sort of scandalized by OA. I look back on that and wish I'd been more confident in that myself.
Do you think that was you're describing a feeling? Did that feeling affect the way the show was made or written?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I felt I would read reviews. Brit doesn't read reviews. I would read reviews, and it reminded me of being a young gay Iranian kid in school. I felt the same stuff, you know, like the Hollywood Reporter guy would, you know, like the comments, even in the New York Times, they would make these sort of like comments about that are just calling it fey, you know, different ways of calling it fey, you know, wool gathering or something like that. And it's like, it wasn't a cool experience. You know, I read, A.O. Scott wrote a review of the New York, from the East in the New York Times, and I thought his criticism was on point. Like, you can get a lot from criticism. I mean, Richard Brody wrote a scathing review in the New Yorker, and I kind of, you know, I was like, I think he has a point. But I think that when you kind of expose yourself like we did with OA, and you kind of do it unconsciously, and then someone goes for the jugular or the thing that you're the most sort of sensitive about, it's quite painful. Of course, it will change. I mean, it'll shut you down as a storyteller, and that's the point, you know.
Or Zal, why do you continue reading reviews then?
Because I think it's important. You're not making something in a vacuum. OA will stand the test of time. You're making something. I mean, when we started Murder at the End of the World, our closest friend, who was the most sort of senior tech person we knew, thought the idea of making him an AI designer, making Andy Ronson an AI guy, was laughable, and that AI was far from ever becoming a reality. And so that actually turned out not to be true, and AI turned out to be completely, I mean, what would the show be like if AI hadn't come out, or if we'd come out, you know, because of the double strikes, we came out late. What if we'd come out earlier, right as the AI thing was cresting? And I think at some point FX was like, we should come out in July because that's when the AI conversation was happening. So I think that that's a big part of making something, is when it's coming out and how it's being received. And I think that the reviews are okay. I mean, I don't mind that those people are doing that existentially. I just, as a person trying to tell stories, it hurt me, but that's okay for me to be hurt. That, you know, it's okay to be sort of wounded or to get put in your shell. And maybe I will get the confidence in the next couple of years to become even bolder. I don't know, maybe not, but I don't think that's such a big deal. I don't mind reading reviews. I don't mind having that kind of engagement with the world.
I mind. For some reason, I've never been able to do it or go there. I mean, I hear some things filtered through people, but I think mostly I trust, there's like a couple people in my life who I trust their perspective to tell me the criticism and the praise, like both the parts that will be of value, you know, towards continuing on. And for me, that's just what I need, or how I have to go about it.
Yeah, wait, neither of you have answered my question.
Do you read things, Malcolm, about your work or do you just like, I'm not going to even go? Did you
Good
ever
question.
in your history of writing?
I mean, a little bit. There isn't much of a critical infrastructure around podcasts and books anymore, or never was around podcasts, isn't anymore around books. So you're kind of free of that. But I object to to how idiosyncratic. And I have a rule of thumb, which is, the more popular a work is, the more critics you have, right? If 80% of of the people who appreciate something like it and 20% dislike it, if 100 people see it, you have 20 critics. If 1 million people see it, you have 200,000 critics. Now, which of those two conditions would you rather be in? The latter. But that means you have 200,000 people who don't like what you did. Whatever, fine.
Right.
I just take it as evidence that lots of people must like it. But no, I'm interested. I'm not interested in what the world says in retrospect. I'm interested in what you think in retrospect. And is it, or if you don't, if it's fine, if
Oh no,
if you
it
don't go
matters.
back and reflect on it, that's fine too. I'm just curious.
No, I think we do a lot. I mean, I think there are things inside OA we still talk about. We're like, oh, would it have been more effective if you hadn't been in her point of view, Prairie Johnson or the OA's point of view? What if you'd been in the point of view of Steve Winchell or French, one of the teenage boys, and you'd been in your community and then you'd watch this weird outsider, the girl that got kidnapped when you were kids, come home and you'd done the story from that perspective, would that have grounded it more in a way? I mean, we talk about things like that all the time. And maybe like you were saying earlier, option 2, option 7, option 8, it kind of doesn't matter. We chose one, we went there, we made something that I feel so proud of. I mean, I hadn't seen it in years. And then randomly I went back the other day and watched just randomly episode 6 of season 1. And this is a weird thing to say about one's own work, but it got me. I forgot I had anything to do with it. I forgot like even when I was on screen, I didn't know myself or recognize myself. And I was just like held by the storytelling. I was like, I don't know what's happening next, but I want to go wherever this is going. And so that was a cool feeling. And we even talk about that right now with A Murder at the End of the World. I mean, we don't have as much distance from that, but we have some. And sometimes I look at it and I'm like, wow, okay, that was really 2 wholly distinct stories. It's like we made a whodunit, in the snows of Iceland, that was, as you were saying, like trying to tackle some big ideas about who has actually done it right now in the world, like who's to blame for some of the spaces that we've gotten ourselves into. And then on the other hand, we were making a basically road trip love story about, 2 people who come into their identities, come into a young adulthood together while trailing the case of a serial killer as amateur sleuths. I mean, those are 2 television shows, and we could have pitched them as 2 television shows, but for some reason we were delighted by the idea of braiding them and delighted by the idea that those 2 stories become deeper when they're cut with the other. That it meant something to braid that high-low, to see how extreme it is, the concentration of wealth, in some of these tech summits, and then what it means for 2 kids that are just trying to solve something, on laptops in their basements in the Midwest who don't have anything, who don't have the same kind of power that Andy Ronson has, but they have love and they have their idealism, and it leads them someplace.
And they have each other.
And they have each other. And every time we tried to unbraid it and just be like, well, let's just tell one of these, it felt like it didn't have the same depth that would be provocative for us to sit every day and work on it and spend the better part of 4 years of our lives writing it and trying to realize it, So, but we ask ourselves those questions all the time. And I think we're always trying to get better at this strange thing of taking things that are inside our imagination and trying to get good enough to articulate them first on the page and then on screen. And this is maybe why Zal reads reviews. I think ultimately what you hunger for is a communication with the audience, like a direct line of communication where nothing is dropped. And I I don't think we're there yet, but I think every time we get a little better at it, and it makes you want to keep going because you're just like, oh, the next time, you know, it'll be more like an umbilical cord and less like, you know, I've got this glass of water. This is the idea. And we're going to just pour it in our hands and we're going to try to carry the water across the football field and not let, you know, the water drip through our fingers. You know, that's sometimes what it can feel like.
Talk a little bit about your relationship to the infrastructure, right? So unlike the kind of storytelling I do, there's no infrastructure in my storytelling. I write it, and it's done, right? The podcasts, I write it, then I speak it into a microphone, and we add some sound design, and it's done. But like, there's no infrastructure. We don't have to go and meet with and communicate with a variety of Hollywood executives and such. I know that this is something sponsored by, in part, by your studio, but nonetheless, talk about how does that's what makes filmmaking so unusual. That it's a triad. It's not just you in the audience, it's you, the audience, and the studio. Right? So what's the significance of this unusual third position in the relationship?
We've had good luck on that. And I guess, yeah, we've had some good luck because when we were at Netflix, it was run by someone named Cindy Holland, who was special. And FX is run by a guy named John Landgraf, who you know, and Gina Balian, who we dealt with, one of the co-presidents. And they're cool people. They're smart and interesting and care about stories and care about they understand the responsibility of storytelling. So
what does that mean, the responsibility of storytelling?
You know, those initial stories that Cindy and Ted greenlit on Netflix, House of Cards, Orange is the New Black, The Crown, Stranger Things, OA. They were special. You know, they created that platform. You know, they made that platform what it was, and they were special stories. And there was a lot of just natural feminism in those stories. There was a lot of natural diversity in those stories. There was a lot there. And so when you had the most powerful or largest service of storytelling in the world, they were taking that responsibility seriously. At that time, I felt that, you know, and I think that Landgraf and Gina care a lot about what stories they're telling. I mean, you know, if you look at Shogun, they really did that with a lot of care. You could easily not do that with care, the care that they did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that, yeah, I just feel like I don't think I at least don't encounter people realizing how powerful these stories are. They are literally shaping the world. You know, Brit and I once read this thing of how the laser was invented. Or is that from one of your podcasts? I can't remember.
That's from that book on time, I think.
Yeah, the laser thing is crazy because this guy just grew up obsessed with lasers in science fiction. And then like one night he like wakes up and like knows how to build a laser, even though he shouldn't have. Like it was a jump, like a technological jump.
But he'd studied physics and he devoted himself to learning everything he could learn that would maybe lead to building the laser. But it still, when he got to the end of it, accumulating all the knowledge he thought was necessary, there's still no way to build the laser. And then he has a dream and wakes up and like invents the laser. But it came from the science fiction he read when he was 10. So I think that's what part of what Zal means when he says responsibility, or something we talk about a lot, which is that it's very hard for the, you know, movies and TV shows and these things, they're like dreams. They're our collective unconscious that we're then realizing and putting out there and then re-ingesting all of us. So of course we often walk into what we have seen on screen. It's like when we used to go to the theaters all together, it was dark and quiet, and we were all, our attention completely held for 2 hours. We were in a dream together. And then those image systems and the things that do or don't happen, the permissions that are or aren't given to people, then, we literally enact those things in the world. It's like, I mean, when I was a kid, I would cling on to certain things I would see on screen or performances like they were life rafts in a rough sea. I remember seeing Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs, and it was the first thing I saw where I felt a young woman was being taken seriously and was taking herself seriously. And I had to close my eyes for most of the scary stuff because I was so young and I thought it was too terrifying. But seeing Jodie Foster on screen like that and seeing the writer and the filmmaker give her the permission to solve the case or to authorize herself to believe that she deserved to be in those rooms of men, that she had every right to be over the scene of the crime and solving something, that had a huge impact on me as a kid because there was nothing else like it. And so I think you grow up knowing that there were a handful of stories that saved you and feeling like you have a responsibility to help generate the stories that might be those life rafts for other people that you would never meet. Like,
I mean, certainly in my lifetime, I think the most radical thing I've seen is not all the technologies, which are pretty astounding, and all the changes that have happened. I think the most radical thing I've seen is women starting to tell their own stories on the screen. And that has happened in the last 5 years, really taken to a new level. And of course, I work with someone who is part of that wave. And it's really a remarkable, I don't think we realize how radical it is. And it reminds me of the American West a little bit. It's like, it's like when LA first formed, like so many things were possible. And I think that's true with women telling their own stories on screen, not just writing them, but then directing them or acting in them too. And to me, that's like a big reason why we wanted to make A Murder at the End of the World. Brit was like, I'm tired. We were studying mysteries, and as Brit said the other day, like if you take them in, one a month, you don't really notice it. But if you like sit down, like two writers sit down and you watch 4 or 5 of them in a day, they all begin with this beautiful young woman dead, naked, in the water, or in a dumpster. And then these guys come on the scene and they're like, this guy was a real artist. We've got to catch him. He's playing on the women. And, it's like, Brit was like, well, can we just pick her up, give her life, clean her up, put clothes on her, and invite her to solve not only, the mysteries of the past, but also the mysteries of the present, the murders of the present. Who better to solve the deaths of unidentified young women than a young woman?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Will we see, or this is probably our last question, but is Darby, are we going to see Darby again?
I think we could. We said we totally could, I mean, when we made this, we definitely thought of it as like just a novel, with a beginning, middle, and end, and wanted it to be satisfying and feel that sense of closure when you got to the end. But Darby's a really interesting character, and I think part of the fun of telling her story is that you saw like part of her maturation, but you haven't seen all of it. There's certainly a lot of places you could take Darby and continue to see her evolve, and it would be very interesting. So, but that, as you pointed out, that those are for the fates to decide, because it's more than just us and the audience. There's this whole other apparatus at play, so we have to see.
But you could see like a 30-something Emma solving a crime, and that, just like minding her own business, Darby, and then, like Murder, She Wrote, another murder falls on her doorstep and she has to solve it. So
I hope that is more than a promise, or more than a tease, what you guys have just said, because I would like to see her. I would like to see your company. Guys, I think our time is up. This has been predictably lovely. And thank you so much. And thank you to the Writers Guild Foundation for giving us the opportunity to talk. We could have talked much longer. But thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm.
It's been really lovely. Thanks, Z.
Thanks, WGA.